I'll let you take it.
Okay, thank you so much, Patsy. Thank you, Gail, for being here. So today's webinar is the second TIFty Tuesday webinar about creating more equitable and inclusive ABE classrooms with DEI. So this is such an important topic, and we are so very lucky to have two wonderful experts, subject or people who have a very deep knowledge of this topic with us today. We have Sydney Sanders, who is joining us from her Fulbright teaching program in South Africa. And Sydney has roots here in Minnesota. Some of you might know she developed the Anti-Racist Study Circle for Hamlin, and she has worked in Minnesota adult ed. And then we also have Sudie Whalen from Links joining us today. And Sudie is the online learning director for Links. And they will both be coming on in just a little while. And then I am Stephanie Summers. I am the ACES coordinator for Atlas. And I am excited to share a topic with you today that we hope to speak more about as a Minnesota community in later this spring, and we'll talk about that opportunity as well. So our objectives for today, we're going to understand the rationale for including a focus on DEI in our ABE instruction. Why is that important? Why is this something people are talking about more and more frequently? We're going to get some tips for ways that we can help our students feel more included and represented in an ABE classroom. And then towards the end of the webinar, we'll talk about some resources, and we'll also be finding out where we can access those newly updated TIF 2.0 lesson plans. And we'll take a look at some of those. All right, so great to have people here. Okay, and just checking the chat, looks like just a lot of wonderful welcome messages. Okay, so to get started, I am sharing with you something that we have been calling a definition, but it would be more accurate to say these are some commitments. And so when we talk about these terms, DEI stands for diversity, equity, and inclusion. And when we talk about these terms, sort of what are we talking about? Well, in a sense, what we're talking about is committing to certain norms and practices, okay? So when we talk about having a commitment to diversity, we're talking about increasing diversity, which is expressed in myriad forms, including race and ethnicity, gender and gender identity, sexual orientation, socioeconomic status, language, culture, national origin, religious commitments, age, ability status, and political perspective, okay? Equity, when we talk about equity, we are committing to working actively to challenge and respond to bias, harassment, and discrimination. We are committed to a policy of equal opportunity for all persons and do not discriminate on the basis of race, color, national origin, age, marital status, sex, sexual orientation, gender identity, gender expression, disability, religion, height, weight, or veteran status. And then when it comes to inclusion, and I'll point out this particular definition comes from the University of Michigan, and so they use the term campus, but we commit to pursuing deliberate efforts to ensure that our campus or our classrooms, our program is a place where differences are welcomed, different perspectives are respectfully heard, and where every individual feels a sense of belonging and inclusion. We know that by building a critical mass of diverse groups on campus and creating a vibrant climate of inclusiveness, we can more effectively leverage the resources of diversity to advance our collective capabilities. Okay. So because we have decided to include DEI as a special area of focus in ACES TIF going forward, we do think it's important for people to understand what that means. And this is just one definition of DEI. There are many others. And again, that's really not even so much a definition, but a list of commitments. And so I just wanted to pause for a moment and let people react to what you've just read. And Gail also put that into the chat. So if you wanted to refer again to that definition, you can go to the website for the University of Michigan. Did you feel comfortable with what you read there with those commitments? Was there something that did or didn't click for you? And I just wanted to invite people, if you had any comments or thoughts, you could share them in the chat. You could also reach out to me via email. If you're not comfortable, you don't have to share in the chat. But because this is becoming a part of our shared work, we want to give people an opportunity to weigh in. And most importantly for today, we want to be coming from a place of shared understanding, and we don't want any particular language to get in the way of this message. So please know that's just one definition or one way of thinking about DEI. And I think Sydney and Sudi will give us some other ways of framing it. And if you have any thoughts about that series of commitments, you can feel free to reach out, okay? Heather said she likes how that particular definition frames things as a commitment. And then Astrid sharing, she thinks these commitments are consistent with the commitments in the Minnesota ABE equity statement. So that's great to know that we are delivering consistent messages. Wonderful. Thanks, Astrid. Okay. And then I did just a little bit of looking into the research, and Sudi will share more with us. But I think it's important to think about, why is it important to address equity? And I think we all know in ABE that our systems, our government systems, our social systems in the United States have not always done a great job of serving diverse groups of people, right? So we know that many of our adult learners, especially our adult learners who are also people of color, have maybe had unsuccessful experiences with education, let alone higher education. And we know that they carry some of those past experiences, past trauma with them when they come into our classrooms, right? And we know that having that history can make it more difficult for them to learn. So to me, part of why it's important to focus on DEI has to do with that saying, when we know better, we can do better, right? We know today how important it is to have representation. We know there's research that's been done around the difference it can make when young people, for example, see teachers who look like them, what it can do for people when there's representation in media. And so we want to be intentional about trying to help our adult learners start from a better place when they have been underserved in the past. How can we do a better job of serving them going forward? And to me, that's a big reason for focusing on DEI, okay? So it is important to understand and address proactively the needs of our students of color and our students who come from all types of diverse backgrounds. And when we take steps to do that, we are helping to position them to be more successful than they have been in the past. And therefore, we are saying we are programs who care about the success of all of our learners. Additionally, and I shared this graphic during our last webinar, we talk in ACES TIF about how we want to make our ABE classrooms mirrors or reflections of a target environment. And we know that for those of us in Minnesota, for example, our students are going to be going off to work in companies with a diverse workforce. If our students get into higher ed and training programs, they are going to be interacting with people who don't necessarily look like them, people who speak a different language. And so I also think a piece of DEI involves helping our students who maybe come from more homogeneous backgrounds understand what it means to be respectful of diverse working and being in school in a diverse environment, so that going forward, they can feel more comfortable and confident when they get into those target environments. And I hope that makes sense to everyone. Please do feel free to use the chat if you have anything to share. But I think that it starts in our classrooms using language and setting norms that help our students be prepared when they leave our classes to work with diverse communities. Okay. So with that, I am going to again welcome and thank Sudie Whalen for being here. And Sudie is going to come on screen and I'm going to go off screen. Thank you, Sudie.
Thank you, Stephanie, for getting us started with some great background information and some great first steps. I appreciate you. And thank you all for being on here with us today. So my name is Sudie Whalen. I'm the Director of Online Learning for LINCS. And for those of you who don't know, LINCS is a National Professional Development or PD center that's funded for adult education, specifically made for us. That's funded by WIOA at the U.S. Department of Ed, Office of Career, Technical, and Adult Education, also known as OCTAE. At LINCS, I oversee updates and development of courses, and then I also lend my subject matter expertise if the content is requested and Department of Ed asked me to. Last year, actually 2021, the U.S. Department of Ed decided they would like to have a course on diversity, equity, and inclusion. And at a meeting that I missed, I was voluntold to develop the course because this is an area that I have done a lot of work in over the years. But it was something I was very happy to be voluntold to do, and it was something that I really care about because we've been spending a lot of time researching what is diversity, equity, inclusion look like in adult education, doing literature reviews, research briefs, and developing content. And so it just felt like it made sense to do that at the national level. So within the course, there's a lot of information that kind of sets the stage for why this is important, that kind of piggybacks on what Stephanie was just talking about. Research tells us that an intentional focus on topics related to diversity, equity, and inclusion within our classrooms improves students' sense of identity and belongingness and positively impacts cognitive development. Education agencies that allow students to engage with racially diverse populations through learning and cross-racial interactions have measurable positive outputs and effects on all students, regardless of that individual student's frequency of engagement with diverse populations outside the classroom. So what that tells us is when we give students the opportunity to engage with diverse populations in the classroom, even if that's not the type of people that they usually get to interact with in their daily life, they see positive results in their ways they interact with people and in their cognitive development. Research also tells us that working on structural issues around DEI as well as individual biases are both needed to create inclusive classroom spaces and school environments. Not focusing on DEI can actually lead to statistics like those we saw in the 2016 study, which found that non-Black teachers of Black students held lower expectations for their students than Black teachers of Black students. Research findings have also shown that Black and Latinx students, regardless of gender, they experience higher levels of stereotype threat. And stereotype threat basically means I think those around me are going to assume I'm going to do badly. Therefore, that impacts my mental capacity to do well on an assessment and is reflected in test scores. stereotype threat actually impacts every demographic group. If you read the book Whistling Vivaldi by Dr. Claude Steele, he talks about how that impacts every demographic group, not just people of color, but Black and Latinx students are more likely to experience stereotype threat simply because they don't think their teachers have high expectations of them. On the flip side of that, teachers having high expectations of specific demographic groups can also negatively impact those demographic groups. For example, studies that were conducted in the 1970s and then replicated again in the late 2000s about Asian students in the quote unquote model minority myth found that Asian students were less likely to receive the support they needed in the classroom simply because their teachers assumed that they would do well. So when we understand and we are equipped with a range of voices and perspectives throughout the ranks of our staff, within our programs, and even within our students, we're better able to innovate, take risks, solve problems more creatively, bounce back from failures, and turn challenges into opportunities. And not just because I said so, but because research and studies have told us this, right? So why do we focus on DEI? Because an intentional focus on DEI provides benefits to both students and staff, as well as your entire agency as a whole. So that intentionality really helps move the needle forward, not just for your students, but also for people that are working within that environment. So I say all that to say that this is the research basis for the new course. We have a new course that's titled Diversity, Equity, and Inclusion from Awareness to Action. And that title was actually very intentional. We started out thinking about the fact that the issue with DEI wasn't necessarily that people weren't committed or weren't interested or didn't want to embrace diversity, be more inclusive, and be more equitable. It was actually that getting those commitments and that want to and moving it into action was where we saw a lot of stalling happen. It takes a lot more effort to actually put action behind wanting and caring about something. So that's why we created this course. The course can be accessed at the link that I think we're going to pop into the chat for you. And so through that link, when you get there, you're going to be asked to register for the course or sign up for the course. If you already have a Links account, you can self-register into the course. But if you do not have a Links account, you'll need to sign up for a Links account. It's free of charge. Links will never charge you to attend any training or anything like that. And it's there available for you. It's also certificate bearing. So once you complete the course, you can get a certificate that demonstrates the number of hours that the course was on the certificate. So when we look into the course, and thank you, Stephanie, for that comment when she said, I want to do this, but I'm not sure how, and I think action steps are so important. That's very true. And what's really cool about the course is it takes us from some awareness building into putting that into action, into focus. Whether we're talking about our DEI self-assessment, the inclusive classroom self-assessment, we even have equity audit tools for programs and for the classroom level, so you can actually put some action behind it. But we also ask you to think about what are your DEI specific SMART goals and to plan towards achieving those, either at the individual or at the organizational level if you want to do this with a team. So our objectives of the course are that we're hoping you'll be able to understand and define what is meant by diversity, equity, inclusion in the classroom and in the program. Identify steps that you as an individual can take to progressively move forward your DEI commitments into actions at the individual and program level. And then also identify steps for conducting an equity audit and work towards sustainability of your DEI efforts. And again, there's two different types of equity audits. There's the classroom and the program level. Program, of course, is far more intensive because it's a program and you have to look into a lot of different areas, right? But the classroom equity audit is a really great place to start if you're a teacher who's just trying to figure out what can I do within my sphere of influence. Likewise, there's also fun activities in there to help you identify who your students are and who your students could be within your community, using publicly available census data and all kinds of different things like that. We even included an online scavenger hunt for those who like to go in and play with data, because I'm a nerd and I like things like that. And I thought that might be kind of a fun way to engage with that type of data. So some of the concepts and activities included in the course are helping you to understand and define DEI, like I mentioned a moment ago, but also collecting, organizing, and analyzing the demographics of the population you currently serve or could be serving. And the reason I say could be serving is because we have seen in some equity audits where sometimes the program is serving one really large demographic group, but you have a whole separate set of demographic, of socioeconomic demographics within your area that are not being served, that you may not have even realized were in that region without looking at the census data. So it gives you opportunities to kind of expand your horizons in terms of outreach, marketing, those kinds of things. We also hope that you'll look at or not hope that, but the concepts include intentionality, regard, cultural competence, and what does cultural competence and inclusion really look like. One of my favorite parts of this course are 2 specific videos that are in here that give us the student perspective. One is a student perspective if the students who have experienced microaggressions in the classroom, what that looked like for them, what it felt like for them. But another video is also about why students choose adult ed and why it's so important to them to have access to these adult education services and how that's worked out for them. And having these opportunities to hear directly from students from my teacher heart is very uplifting and also helps me solidify why this is important. We also include concepts about understanding removing bias within your classroom and your program. And then also lastly, that conducting an equity audit. That's where all this is leading towards, is doing those equity audits either at your program or classroom level. Now, you'll notice if you sign up for the course that within the course, we do have some suggestions for pacing yourself as you do the course. Now, the course takes approximately 6 hours, but you can make it take a little bit longer than that. We don't suggest you do it all in one sitting or anything like that. We actually ask that you space out the units by 1 week at least to give yourself time to reflect and observe and absorb what you're learning. And also think about where you fit into the information that you're learning, where your areas of growth are. We also ask that you give yourself grace and space. And so as you see yourself watching videos and reading the content, and you see yourself in an area that you're like, oh, I might have made a mistake, give yourself grace. We all make mistakes. Every time I watch that microaggressions video, I cringe thinking about 10 years ago an interaction I might have had with a student and how I've grown since then and what I can do better and how I can continue to grow. Every day I am learning and growing. So just remember, as you're taking this course that, and if you decide to take it, that we hope that you'll learn and grow and not take this as an opportunity to place judgment within yourself or upon yourself. So within the course also are some really great resources that I really like, and that there's a lot of them in there, but the ones I wanted to highlight here are the cultural competence self-assessment, the inclusive classroom self-assessment, the classroom equity audit tool, and the program equity audit tool. But there's a lot more stuff in there, including the DAI self-assessments. There's so many resources. There's even some resources for ways that you can get information about your students and ask questions to get to know them better, including what are their preferred pronouns and those kinds of basic things. So we include some survey and questionnaire samples and all kinds of really great stuff for you to utilize. So I did also want to mention that within the next couple of months, actually, Minnesota has graciously offered wants you all to engage with this course if you have the opportunity to. And we'll actually be having a kickoff webinar and a closeout webinar for those who do decide to engage in that cohort of doing the course. It is a self-paced asynchronous course, but what we'll do is we'll do a kickoff overview webinar, giving you a lot more information about what to expect as you dive into that course. And then we'll close it off together and giving you some time to really think, reflect, and discuss what you've learned and what your next steps are. Those events are coming up on May 4th from 4 to 5 p.m. and then again on June 15th from 3 to 4 p.m. If you have any questions or anything like that, I'm going to be sticking around for a little while and I have a couple of minutes to respond to any questions you have now.
All right. Thank you so much, Sudie, for all of that wonderful information and for helping us to get an overview of this course and for introducing yourself so people who might be interested in joining the course cohort will know who you are and will have an idea of what that is all about. So this cohort is part of the diversity and equity grant. That is some of the work going on at the state level. And as Astrid put in the chat, we will have more information, some promotional information and registration links available very soon. And I'm going to ask people if you have any questions or comments for Sudie or just want to say great job. We can do that while I get my slides back up here. And Astrid, did you want to say anything else about the course or the cohort coming up, or?
No, just stay tuned. We'll make sure to email this webinar's participant list directly with information. We just got the details solidified, so we'll be putting together some more information and some registration for those webinars. So stay tuned for that, and looking forward to working with you later this spring, Sudie. Thanks for being here.
Yes, wonderful. Okay, thank you so much, Sudie. Sudie is so wonderful. She postponed her trip. She's taking off to the TESOL conference, and she waited around to join us today. So thank you so much, Sudie. Safe travels to you, and we really appreciate you sharing your time and expertise with us today. Next, we have Sydney Sanders, a Fulbright English teaching assistant currently in Cape Town, South Africa. Sydney is going to share with us some of her personal story that sort of inspired her to start doing some of this work. And then she, like Sudie talked about, is going to talk about some maybe some sort of beginning action steps that people can take if they would like to go a little bit deeper into this topic. So thank you so much for being here, Sydney. And please let me know. I'll start with your first slide here.
Perfect. Thank you. Thank you so much, Stephanie and Sudie. That sounds like such a great course. I cannot wait to look at that link and look more into it. So my name is Sydney, everyone. And yeah, exactly as Stephanie said, I'm just going to walk you through. I know we've now heard, a couple different ways of what is DEI. But I think sometimes with these terms, it's helpful to hear it a couple of different ways. So I'm just going to also say, how I think about it too. And hopefully it's a helpful way for people to really visualize the differences in these terms. All right. So this is a quote from Dafina Lazarus Stewart. And I really like the way that it helps me visualize. So she says, diversity asks who's in the room, right? Inclusion asks, has everyone's ideas been heard? Equity responds, who is trying to get in the room but can't? Whose presence is in the room is under constant threat of erasure? And justice responds, whose ideas won't be taken as seriously because they aren't in the majority. All right. So as we're thinking about DEI and justice and what do these terms mean, right? It's not enough to have people in the color in the room or people of different abilities or people of different genders, right? We need to make sure that everyone is genuinely heard and valued. And from personal experience, I have felt the harm of being invited into a room solely because I'm brown, right? Feeling tokenized for being brown, right? But then no one actually listens or values what I have to say, right? And that's why I think we need that justice part too. And we can call it, DEI and adult ed. There's no issue there, really. It's up to you and what terms you want to use. But I'm just also proposing to think about how justice fits into all of our work too, right? So with my teaching, what I try to do is really listen and value and take seriously other people's ideas and experiences, right? And one thing I hear from educators often is that they love meeting and learning from people of other cultures, right? That's why we teach adult ed. Because it's so fun and it's so interesting, right? And that's an excellent place to start, right? But DEI and justice-centered education is also asking us to really learn from, really value more than just at the surface level, right? And so we'll take a look at how to do a bit more of that, right? Next, please. So before we get into the how, for me personally, I always just like giving a bit of my story to really explain, why does this work matter? Especially why does it matter to me? Why do I commit? We talked about those commitments earlier, right? Like, why do I commit to this? All right. So a little bit about my story. It's complicated, but I'll kind of do a quick summary here, but I am mixed race or multiracial. My mother, as you can see in the family, very mixed race family. We all look, different, but also everyone also says that we're all twins of each other, right? But my mother is Louisiana Creole, which oversimplification means that we're mixed between African, Native American, and European. And then my father is a mix of European and Native, though he only identifies as white. And that's a whole nother thing that I don't have time to get into, right? And I was raised to tell everyone that I'm white, which I was always the kid asking, like, why? I'm not white. I am brown. Yes, I am lighter skinned, but growing up with a family that looks like this, I didn't see myself any different than what my mother looked like, right? Or my grandparents. And so I would always, as a kid, question, why do I tell people I'm white? And it wasn't until I was in maybe late high school, early college, where my mom finally answered the question of why. And she said, because even today, it's still safer, right? And that was a big moment for me to really think about, even in this day and age, right? That is something my mom struggles with, is having lighter skinned kids, wanting them to be seen as white because it's safer for them, right? So even though I was raised to say I was white, I never felt only white. I've pretty much always identified as a person of color, even if I didn't have that terminology yet. And in school, I felt invisible and unimportant for numerous reasons, but from curriculum that didn't reflect me and my family, right? Reading stories in class about people who didn't look like me, who didn't come from a similar culture to me, right? Just made me feel other, right? And different. Another way is thinking I was stupid because I kind of move and think and talk at a slower pace than most people. I'm not an interrupter. I listen, I take things in. And it wasn't until later on that I realized, like, that is a cultural way of communication, right? I come from a minority culture, and especially these teachings from my uncle, who has closer ties to our Native American history and our family, taught me from a young age to listen first, right? To not speak over elders and to really take that in before I speak, right? And so realizing that I have a different communication style than other people. Also, I knew that my grandparents didn't talk right because they're from rural Louisiana and speak either like rural English, African American vernacular. I don't really know exact terms you want to use, but right, just knowing that they didn't talk right and that I had to talk differently because I am educated and that I needed to sound educated, right? So when I fell into teaching, I signed up to serve as a Vista, AmeriCorps Vista in Minnesota in 2017, and my project was to work in a computer lab and to build sustainability and distance learning. But I started assisting in what we call the pre-beginning, like level 1 class, and I loved it. But honestly, I was scared to teach English because I knew my family had lost our Indigenous, Native American, and African languages because they feared for their lives, because they were told that they need English to survive, right? And I didn't want to keep perpetuating that harm, right? I knew English wasn't inherently bad, but the way it's taught is harmful, right? Or can be harmful. So in 2019, I decided, keep going with English teaching, and I got my TEFL certificate at Hamlin, and then I joined the MA program at Hamlin also to kind of figure out how could I teach English in a more equitable way. And again, this year I'm serving as a Fulbrighter in South Africa, and even here, because it's such a multilingual place, I'm really trying to learn about how can we teach English in a more inclusive way of other languages. All right. Next, please. And so just a connection to South Africa, because I always have to share this quote, but it's one of my favorite quotes. It really does, it gets me, right? But kind of from my story, you can see that learners, and it's not only my story, right? But I'm just here and I'm speaking from my experience, but learners get so many messages that tell us every day that we are the minority, right? That our culture, our experiences are inferior. And I could talk about that for hours, but I hope my story gives you at least a couple of examples of the harm that could potentially happen in a classroom, right? And so I really believe that this quote gets at this idea. So if anyone's ever heard of the book Born a Crime by Trevor Noah, he paraphrases a famous Nelson Mandela quote that's like, if you speak to a man in a language that he knows, it goes to his head. If you speak to him in his language, it goes to his heart. So the way that Trevor paraphrases this, he says, when you make the effort to speak someone else's language, even if it's just just basic phrases here and there, you are saying to them, I understand that you have a culture and identity that exists beyond me. I see you as a human being, right? So above all else, I want to make sure that learners I teach know I see them as human beings. And I really believe the way to do that is through DEI, through anti-racist, through justice-centered teaching, whichever of the terms you want to use, right? But I really do try to bring in my students' languages and cultures into the classroom to really show them that I value them. All right, next, please. So that's as much as I'll tell you about my story at the moment, but I thought it would also be worth me telling you some of the gaps that I see in adult ed DEI training, right? And so I don't really see, or I think now starting to see a bit more of that, but at first I didn't really see anything past Racism 101. Right. Which is why I started my program at Hamlin, because I wanted to kind of figure out how do we get past this? Because I saw it as a huge gap. Excuse me, at least what I could see in Minnesota. You know, in Racism 101, I really think about just the basics of what is racism, maybe what is white privilege. Now, if that's where you are in your journey, that is okay, because it is a journey, right? But for myself, for some of my colleagues, we wanted to see what could be next. And so that's kind of where I'm hoping to see the field go. So earlier, Sudi said the links course really takes from, I can't remember the exact words, but from reflection to action. And that's, exactly what I'm saying. And my next point is that I didn't see anything that went past reflection. And that's where a lot of teachers and educators can get stuck, right? Is how do we actually do this in our classrooms, right? And so finding a way to make those connections to action, I was not seeing in adult ed. And that's why I'm so excited to see that with the links training too. And then finally, as a person of color, or BIPOC, if you know that term, Black, Indigenous person of color, I didn't see anything that really also addressed our needs as educators who come from minority cultures, right? I felt invisible because we did often just talk about maybe white privilege, and then I couldn't really participate in that in the same exact way, right? So those are just some of the gaps that I saw when I started at Hamlin. Still feel like we haven't progressed too much, but again, that's only been a couple of years. But again, very excited to see this links course too, right? Next, please. So again, also building off of something else Sudi said, mistakes are part of the process. After a lot of conversations with colleagues, I know many of us get stuck from really implementing these anti-racist or DEI strategies or changes because we're afraid of making mistakes, right? We don't want to cause potentially more harm by saying the wrong thing, right? But we tell our learners it's okay to make mistakes. So why can't we often tell ourselves that, right? So part of examining our own biases includes reflecting on, what's stopping us from doing this work. So I repeat a couple of quotes to myself. These are two of the main ones, but I found it really helpful to repeat these to myself regularly. So the first one, and actually Stephanie kind of referenced it earlier, which I loved the connection there, comes from Maya Angelou. Do the best you can until you know better. Then when you know better, do better, right? This work is about resisting perfectionism, just trying something, little small steps, right? And so since this is a lifelong journey, I know I'll make plenty of mistakes, but I have to keep trying, keep taking those little steps, right? So again, repeating this to myself often. And then the second quote comes from Ibram X. Kendi, and it really reinforces this idea: to be anti-racist is to make mistakes, right? This work, acknowledging that mistakes are part of the process, that really kind of helps relieve some of that pressure some of us maybe feel that keeps us from really trying it, right? So again, if you need encouragement, I recommend, writing these quotes down or seeing them regularly, saying them to yourselves, because it's really helped me out. All right, next slide, please.
Okay, I'm gonna say one moment while I get the video ready, okay? And for everyone who is, maybe trying to write these quotes down, we will be sharing a PDF of this presentation with you, so you'll have those. We don't want anyone to worry about that. All right, let's see if I have learned anything. Oops, no, I have not. Okay. What is, nope, one more moment, please. I apologize.
While you're bringing it up, can I just kind of introduce it and say, for anyone who doesn't know Ibram X. Kendi, his book, How to Be an Anti-Racist, is great. See people, mentioning it also in the comments, but this is just a small clip of him defining what is anti-racist.
Okay, are you seeing it now? Are you able to see the video on my screen right now?
Yes.
Okay,
Yes.
all right. Then I'm just gonna advance it to the correct place, hopefully. I think we might have to let the ad go.
And so what I'm trying to do with my work is to really get Americans to eliminate the concept of not racist from their vocabulary and realize we're either being racist or anti-racist. We're either expressing ideas that suggest certain racial groups are better or worse than others, superior or inferior than others. We're either being racist or we're being anti-racist. We're expressing notions that the racial groups are equals, despite any cultural and ethnic differences. We're either supporting policies that are leading to racial inequities and injustice, like we saw in Louisville, where Breonna Taylor was murdered, or we're supporting policies and pushing policies that are leading to justice and equity for all. And so I think we should be very clear about whether we're expressing racist ideas, about whether we're supporting racist policies, and admit when we are. Because to be anti-racist is to admit when we expressed a racist idea. Is to say, you know what? When I was doing that in Central Park, I was indeed being racist, but I'm gonna change. I'm gonna strive to be anti-racist. And to be racist is to constantly deny the racial inequities that pervade American society, to constantly deny the racist ideas that pervade American minds. And so I want to build a just and equitable society. And the only way we're going to even begin that process is if we admit our racism and start building an anti-racist world. Thank you.
Thank you, Stephanie, for playing that. So can we go back a slide, please?
Sorry.
Thank you. No. So I just wanted to show that video as an example of where to start, especially if you're just kind of dipping into this, or maybe you've been doing this, but you haven't seen this video, and there's always so much more we can learn from Ibram X. Kendi, I believe, or any of the scholars that we might, really like. But again, he's talking about the difference between anti-racist and not racist, right? He goes all into the definition in his book, and we're not here to really fully discuss what exactly that means, but why I think this is a good place to start is Kendi asks us, or really reminds us, to keep an open mind, to listen and acknowledge that people of different races have different experiences. He gives examples of how racist hierarchies play out in different parts of our lives, often in ways that we've maybe never realized before, especially if you identify as white, ways that you've just never thought of because you haven't experienced it in the same way, right? So once we understand these hierarchies, we realize that where in our classrooms, there are areas that we could bring in other perspectives, right? Whether that be in the pictures that we show, the images in class, or the stories we read or listen to. There's lots of little things that we can do to honor our learners' cultures and experiences in the classroom, right? So again, resources like this, reading or watching How to Be an Anti-Racist, right? It's just about helping us become aware of finding those hierarchies so we can start finding some actions, little actions in our classrooms, all right? Next slide, please. This next resource is also one of my other favorite places to start for really moving this work into the classroom, right? So in this book, Culture Responsive Teaching in the Brain by Zaretta Hammond, she shows us so many ways that we can honor learners' cultures in the classrooms, right? So just by reading the whole book is fantastic, or just picking a chapter and then picking one thing of that chapter to try, right? Really starting small so you can reflect and then move into that action for our classroom and then keep building off of that, right? So as I mentioned earlier, a lot of us love learning about the cultures in our classroom. In the book, she's got something called the culture tree, and she has questions that go along with it of really trying to learn more about each other's cultures, right? So even using a tool like that can be so helpful. And another reason I love this book is that it's a fairly easy read. It's not a dense academic book. So I just love that she's really made it accessible for educators. I also really like that she connects it to the brain. So all of her suggestions are DEI focused, but it's also backed by neuroscience for better learning. How, if classes are more relevant to our lives, our brains will learn the information more easily, right? And so I just love that she makes that scientific research based, but then also, why it's also DEI based, right? Next slide, please. And my final suggestion of another idea of where to start, you already have lots of places, whether it's the links course or reading How to Be an Anti-Racist or the Culture Responsive Teaching in the Brain book. But my final suggestion is the study circle that was mentioned earlier that I created with Hamlin and Atlas as part of my master's project. So if you're feeling like you're really ready to dive into these topics, especially with colleagues, I've created a facilitator's guide that you can find on Atlas's website. The link is there, if you look at the PDF of these slides after. And it has, the facilitator's guide has a step-by-step guide. So pretty much everything you would need is there. I could have maybe missed something, but I tried to make it as detailed as possible. The materials are ready, a PowerPoint's ready if you need it, what to read and what questions to answer, right, with colleagues. And so it's based off of 5 meetings that we've done, 5 meeting sessions with Atlas, but take your time, go slowly, try it one step at a time. I have colleagues who are doing just that. They pick one topic, one thing to focus on. They meet maybe bi-weekly or once a month and, discuss it, talk about how to try it in their classroom. They come back, they debrief how it went. They decide if they're ready to move on or to continue talking about it, right? But the important thing is just to keep slowly moving forward. And it's, for me, it's been a very helpful tool to have this conversation with colleagues, and I've really appreciated the conversations that have come out of it, right? Because I believe this work happens through collaboration and really working with each other, so we don't feel so isolated when we're doing this work. And then next slide, please. All right, these are my last 2 slides. They are just a long list of resources that you have access to in the PDF of the slides when you look at that. There's so much you can do with DEI in the classroom, right? But these are just some of my top favorite ones that I use. Some of them I've mentioned already, and then there's other things too about like the diverse images collection. If you want to look for more diverse images, right, you can click on that and there's a whole collection there of where to find them, more videos to watch or things to read. But I hope it's at least a starting place for y'all. And thank you very much for your time today.
Shoot. Okay, there, I'm not muted. Whoa, I don't know if that's better or worse that everyone just heard myself. Okay. Thank you so much, Sydney. So this is Sydney's second page of resources. So we've got 2 really amazing lists of resources here that give you some reading, some places to get started, that wonderful facilitator guide for the Anti-Racist Study Circle. And I just really, really, really want to thank Sydney. Sydney is, like we said, currently out of the country. She's dealing with a big time change. I know it's more evening there than it is here, and she's got technology challenges. So thank you so, so much for agreeing to be here and sharing all of your experiences. And I think the way you framed this makes it so accessible, and it gives us all an access point, which I really appreciate. Before Sydney leaves, I just wanted to invite people, if they have any questions, if they have any comments. We have brought up a lot of a lot of topics in a short amount of time. I also kind of wanted to create some space if what we've been talking about has brought up any feelings, if people wanted to share one of their own experiences, or if you have a thought you'd like to share with us, please feel free. You can use the chat, or we can also invite people to turn on their microphones. So before we move on, please let us know if there's anything you'd like to share about anything we've talked about so far. I see Heather's raising her hand.
Yeah, and thank you. I want to say thank you so much, Cindy, and Sudi, for all of this great information. I'm speaking as a white woman teacher in the classroom, and what it brings up for me right now, I'm teaching social studies, and what I hear often from my African-American students, many of whom are women and many of whom are single mothers in the evening. I teach in the evenings. They keep saying, Heather, why are we only learning about slaves and slavery? There's so much more to our life. And if there's anything, I'm just speaking out to you all, that we can do as a collective force to perhaps change that narrative for some of those summative assessments that they might have to do, say GED or HiSET, or something that would kind of flip that, so that we just don't have to teach about these major Supreme Court decisions. Stephanie, you know what I'm talking about because you and I teach the same. I mean, I hear my students, but at the same time, I want to get them to pass that test, if that makes sense. And Cindy, I see you nodding, and it's like walking that fine line. I want to be aware, but I also want to help them pass that test.
It sounds a little bit like it's difficult when we're teaching history. Of course, we want to acknowledge both sides, all sides, not both sides, all sides. But I would imagine it would be frustrating as a person of color or from a marginalized community to feel like the only time your history comes up in an academic context is in a very negative way.
Exactly. Well put. Thank you.
I don't know if you, obviously we don't want to put you on the spot, Sydney, but if that's ever come up for you before, if it's something that's been brought up in any of the research that you've done, maybe in South Africa, it's come up. I don't know.
Yeah, I don't have anything specific other to acknowledge or affirm that it's a fine line. I don't want to not talk about that stuff because we have, issues where, people do try not to talk about it. And it's important to acknowledge that, slavery happened in the States, but I try to just be conscious of how much of it's like showing the traumatic and the negative aspects, right, of our history. But then, also do something that's centered around Black joy or Native joy or, whatever it is, of trying to show the more positive lights too. So I think for me, it's just kind of being aware. If you literally want to count, that can be helpful too. But, sometimes there are texts that we really need to use to help our students, pass these standardized exams. But if you do have the ability to also use your own resources, then throw in, an article or listening or something on, the beauty of Asian American culture, for an example, right? So I think that's really, sorry, it's not more specific, but I kind of think that's just where we've got to be, is aware of, what are those messages and just not shying away from the difficult ones too.
Thank you, Cindy. I agree. Showing the positivity, which I try to do, but I'm hoping as a collective force, we can also get it to be, let's focus maybe the test more on positive rather than the negative. Although I don't want to not acknowledge the historical context of our nation, right, at the same time. So thank you.
Yeah. I recently heard a story on NPR, Minnesota Public Radio, that has really stuck in my mind, and it was about land acknowledgements. And there were some Native American scholars and activists, representatives of that community, who said, when they hear those land acknowledgements, and I hope everyone knows what I mean, like we are on native land, what they hear is your people used to be here and now they're not, and that's too bad. And he said, every time I hear that, that message is actually painful to me. And he said, I know that's not what it's supposed to be, but that's how it sounds to, you know, from my point of view. And so I think this issue is a little bit similar in my mind. Like if all of your history is basically boiled down to one sort of period that was very negative in American history, and it was a long period, an ongoing period. I just think, yeah, maybe we need to focus a little, make more of an effort to bring in, you know, African-American inventors and musicians and other things that don't tell a single story about the experience. But that is also difficult when we're preparing people for tests and things like that. So, and you says, I agree, focus on the positive aspects rather than the negatives. Okay, does anyone have anything else for Sydney before we transition away, or not really away? We're going to pivot a little bit more specifically to ACES TIF. Okay. Again, really, we want to thank you so sincerely for being here, Sydney. Thank you so much for joining us. And I do hope that, I know I plan to really dig into these resources, and I'm sure that other people will as well. And Heather's saying the Hammond book has great strategies for the classroom. Okay, wonderful. All right, well, anyone who has done a presentation before where you feel like you're following a tough act, that's the very definition of what's happening for me right now. So I am going to spend the last part of this webinar sharing with you some more of our lesson plan updates for TIF 2.0. And we're going to talk about two categories where the lessons have recently been updated. And we just wanted to kind of dig in a little bit about what's going on. So for anyone who maybe is less familiar with ACES TIF, ACES is an initiative. It stands for Academic, Career, and Employability Skills. It has been an ongoing sort of PD focus in Minnesota for the last 10 years. Around helping our adult learners be ready for taking their next steps when they leave adult education, and helping them to be able to more actively participate in their communities, at work, or at school in higher education or training programs. And so the TIF, the Transition Integration Framework, is the document that was developed as part of this initiative. The TIF has 6 categories of transition skills. They are navigating systems, effective communication, developing a future pathways, self-management, learning strategies, critical thinking. Okay. And so for almost the past year now, we have been working on making some updates to the lesson plans, because they are about 10 years old. And so today I will share with you the lessons for 2 categories. We've got effective communication and self-management. Okay. So from the TIF, effective communication is a 2-way process between individuals. I gotta clear my screen here. Individuals of diverse backgrounds and experience, in which information is conveyed and received in ways that are mutually understood as intended. This can include speaking, writing, and all forms of nonverbal communication. Examples of activities in this category could include adjusting communication to suit various audiences, questioning to clarify meaning and to enhance understanding, or articulating differences and appreciating how differences can affect communication. Teaching the skills in this category will help the learner give and receive information in a purposeful, appropriate, and collaborative manner. So effective communication to me goes really well with the topic of diversity, equity, and inclusion, because there are so many cultural aspects to communicating, to the different gestures that we use, and even to the language that we use. Sydney talked about when she was growing up being aware that the way she spoke at home, for example, or the way some of her family members spoke might have been different from what we considered that standard English, and how we talk to our students about their communication style, I think can have either a very positive or very negative effect on their attitude towards learning, right? So when we make space for learners to have different accents, different ways of communicating, different ways of storytelling, I think that's a way of affirming their identities. And when we sort of try to get them to fit into that box of standard American English, I think that can be a little less useful. So we're going to look at these lessons, and I'm just kind of going to give you an overview of what you would find if you were to look at them, okay? And Sydney says, communication strategies are key to cross-cultural communication for our learners and ourselves. So glad this is included. Yes, so this felt like a really great time to talk about this particular category and unveil these lessons, because it does seem to have a very nice overlap with the DEI topic. So for anyone who has not yet seen what our new ACES lesson plan looks like, our lesson plan template, you can see it here. This is just the first page of it. So all of the lesson plans start with some header information that gives us the lesson focus, the course and setting. One thing that we've tried to do is use NRS levels rather than saying like ELL 3 or ELL 4, because these are more consistent across programs. What is ELL 3 to me might be different. Even what's beginning ELL to me could be different. So when we know we're referring to these NRS levels, that provides more consistency. And then we've done an approximate time to complete and the materials needed. So for anyone who might have looked at some of the old lesson plans that have been available on the Atlas website for quite a long time, they did have a somewhat consistent format, but they were really created as teaching tools. So 10 years ago, when we were rolling out ACES TIF, those lesson plans were in part created to help ABE practitioners see sort of the differences between a sort of a regular lesson plan and a lesson plan where these skills were intentionally embedded. And because they were sort of training tools, there is some extra information in them. And so one of our goals with updating them was to make the template more streamlined and to make these seem like more approachable lessons, I guess, without quite so many pieces, without so many pages. So yes, as Heather has said, the new lessons might feel a little bit more grab and go in a sense. And so one thing that has not changed is the sample lesson plans are still available at 3 levels of instruction. So for effective communication, the advanced level focuses on teamwork. The intermediate level focuses on levels of formality, and the beginning level lesson focuses on greetings and gestures. Another thing that we've done 10 years ago, we weren't necessarily using all 3 sets of ABE content standards. So now we do list the ACES TIF standards that can be practiced or taught by using this lesson, as well as the CCR standards and the North Star Digital Literacy standards. So we wanted to show how these are sort of integrated lesson plans where your students really are getting a lot of rich practice with all 3 sets of ABE content standards. And then a big focus for us in redoing these lesson plans was to bring in some of the things that we are talking about now in 2023 that we weren't necessarily talking about in 2013. And so 2 of those key considerations are DEI and social emotional learning. So our focus for today has been on DEI. Our focus for our 3rd and final TIFty Tuesday webinar will be on social emotional learning, or SEL. So the reason we bring in these things is we know that, again, that students can engage and connect more with material when they feel like it has a connection to their own cultures and experiences. And so we have been trying to provide information and just things for teachers to consider when teaching these lessons that are related to each of these topics. So for this lesson, as an example, there is a video the teacher can show that has people greeting each around the world in different cultures. There is also kind of a reminder that greetings and communication is very culturally based. So in the United States, for example, it is perfectly normal and acceptable for people of different genders to shake hands, maybe pat each other on the back, even, work together in a group, right? But in some cultures that might not be the case. And so we want to remind our students, or at least acknowledge for our students, that we understand that that is true, and maybe give them an opportunity to talk about what things are like in their own cultures. Okay, so instead of just teaching this lesson like, here's how we do it in America, you shake hands, we want to acknowledge and affirm that that might be very different from what people do in their own cultures. And maybe even provide them with some language for how they might talk about that, or politely decline to shake hands with someone if they weren't comfortable doing so. Okay. And then this is just a bit of a snapshot of what some of these new lesson materials look like for effective communication. So we've taken one of the texts from Reading Skills for Today's Adults. This is a level 1 text called Greetings. We've reformatted it a little bit so that it's not in a paragraph, but it's, broken into sentences for that really beginning level student. We've added some graphics. We were intentional about trying to make sure that it wasn't just two, Caucasian people hugging, but instead we tried to get some diversity in our images. So there's a reading that the students do. There's questions for them to discuss and answer. And this lesson also includes a pretty simple group project where students work on explaining to each other and creating a poster for how to greet someone in their own language. Overall, these updated lessons include a variety of different texts, videos, graphic organizers, self-reflection and assessment tools, and different collaborative tasks to try to increase learner engagement. So that was another thing. We've tried to not make them too repetitive, but to kind of vary the types of activities that learners are doing, and to also appeal to different, learning styles. And then as one resource, we've already had so many wonderful resources shared, but a resource that might be more specific to effective communication that I recently learned about comes from San Jose State University. They have a section on their website called Homegrown Handouts. And then within that section, they have a subsection devoted to diversity, equity, and inclusion. And so these are all handouts that you could download and read. They've got some information about, including an anti-racist perspective in writing. They have some information around biased language, inclusive language and inclusive writing, LGBTQ plus terminology, offensive language, offensive stereotypes. So, these are resources that might be good for us to look at as educators. And then certainly if we had our students doing any type of writing where this might come up, showing this to them, making these resources available to them. So this is one resource you might want to check out around DEI in writing specifically. And thanks, Gail, put the link in the chat. Okay. Does anyone have any questions or comments about this, about the effective communication lessons? All right. So then the other category we're sharing today is self-management. From the TIF, self-management refers to steps, strategies, and skills that individuals can use toward the achievement of goals. Some examples include organizing study materials, setting goals, and monitoring progress. Teaching self-management will prepare learners to succeed in environments where there is little guidance, structure, and monitoring. These lessons were updated by Heather Turngren, originally created by Liz Andrus. And you'll see, follow that they're using the same template, so that once teachers kind of get familiar with this new template, I think it will be very easy to navigate. For the self-management category, the three levels of lessons, we have time management for the advanced, and then intermediate and beginning both focus on organizing classroom materials. And I asked Heather, because I know she's on this webinar, if she'd be willing to speak just for a minute maybe about these lessons, what things were going through your mind when you were updating them, anything like that.
Sure, Stephanie, thank you. And hello, everyone. Yeah, I have been working with Stephanie, but I want to say that we have been guided through top-notch, our ACES A team. And I think Callie was here earlier and she helped provide some information. And because of this really stellar ACES team with ABE practitioners from around the state helping us, we included this tree just so that we can get a little bit deeper into DEI within our daily ABE instruction, so that remembering this idea about self-management, so much of it could be considered that North American white perspective of keeping things in a certain order. It is important within some job areas, but we should also be very cognizant and thinking about it when we are approaching teaching this with our learners. And so the beginning lesson is just helping very low level students keep their papers together. So perhaps making sure that they know which way the notebook goes, and strategies that one could do to help students know, maybe write your name at the top so that you know that is always going to be at the top. The intermediate lesson dives in a little bit more with reading about different ways that people can keep things organized. And we try with all of the lessons to stretch it into adult career pathways, perhaps IET, but also adult diploma. And that's where that final advanced lesson, I shouldn't say final, but the advanced lesson focus a little bit more so that students are aware of time management, especially as we are thinking about college and career readiness, where your professor might not be as maybe empathetic about not being able to turn in material on time. So it's kind of working that whole spectrum, so to speak, of our learners that we have the joy and privilege of reaching out to every day within ABE instruction. There are strategies to help you with DEI as well as SEL. And what I really like about this update is we also bring in strategies so that you could perhaps use this in a high flex or a hybrid or an online class. It could possibly be used either synchronous or asynchronous. All of this vocabulary that we as instructors did not have when the initial ACES, TIF, and their lessons came out. I mean, look at how much we have grown in our own SEL and DEI within our field. And I'm just happy to be part of this team that Stephanie is kind of leading. So thank you, Stephanie. But I do want to point out a lot of the self-management is around the norms for this North American, predominantly white society. But to be honest, that is what our students will have to work in and then go to school in, and unless things change in the future. Would you agree, Steph?
I would. And again, I think we go a long way in helping our students connect with this topic, even if we just acknowledge that we do understand that these are culturally specific norms and that students' own culture might be different. I think when a student walks into the classroom and they're told, today we're learning about one way of doing things, and it's the way we do it here in the United States. I feel like that message is different from this is what it means to be organized, and this is the only thing it can mean, right? So this culture tree does a great job of showing that. If you kind of look towards the very middle of the tree, you'll see concepts of time here. A little bit further down, I see tempo of work. I see nonverbal communication. And so all of these things, I think, when we share this with our students, it also could lead to a lot of great conversations. And this culture tree actually comes from the book, one of the books that Sydney highlighted, the book from Hammond called Culturally Responsive Teaching and the Brain. So a great resource and a great graphic that we could maybe use with our students to start some conversations. Thank you so much, Heather, for sharing that with us. And I'll just show, here's a little bit more from the self-management lesson plan. So this kind of shows the way the lesson plans are organized with a warm-up, introduction, guided practice, independent practice, and then assessment, reflection, and then an extension activity. And so you can see the lesson plans are laid out with directions for the teacher. It is mentioned when the handout, is going to be needed, and then all of the handouts are in a file after the lesson plan. And one thing that I found in this lesson that I really liked was this priority matrix. So when we're trying to think about tasks and maybe prioritize tasks, here's a framework asking ourselves, how urgent is the task? And having that guide our steps. So I liked that. That's just an example of one of the resources you could use if you decided to check out this lesson plan. So then I do have one resource again to share, and this resource is not necessarily tied to self-management, but this was the resource that I recently wrote about for, there was an article in the ABE Connect newsletter. I really have enjoyed exploring the Morningside Center resource collection. They have some really amazing resources. The one I wrote about for the article was teaching about the idea of respect using the song by Aretha Franklin, having students kind of define what respect means to them, having them talk about what it looks like when they are respected in a classroom, for example. From there, we could maybe come up with some norms or shared responsibilities for the class. They also have great resources for Women's History Month. They had a great lesson on intersectionality and thinking about our different identities. So this is a really rich collection under classroom resources here. So something else I would encourage you to check out if you're looking for some new ideas. All right, we are wrapping up. This webinar has been a little different in that I think we've done a lot of talking and you as participants have done a lot of listening. So I did just want to pause here at the end. Does anyone have any resources or tips or things you've tried in your classrooms to help people feel more included and welcomed? Something that you do, a practice that you have? I would love to see that shared in the chat if you have any ideas. Even if it's, a very small thing, something that you do. We heard from our speakers today that those small concrete actions make a big impact. So if anyone would like to share something in the chat, we'd love to see what you've got to say. I'll pause for a minute to give time. One really,
Stephanie, I'll always jump in. Okay, you know me. One thing I did, because right now I'm teaching native English speakers, people who were born here in the US, as well as ELs, people not born here in the US, is I can no longer have the language of where are you, what country are you from? I have to remove that language. I don't say, what languages do you speak? Because people speak so many different languages, but I have been starting off with a world map, and I ask people, where did you grow up? Okay, so where did you grow up? Spend most of your time. And it feels much more inclusive for my native born students that they can get support on figuring out where they grew up and such. And it's a way to connect everyone instead of just saying what country you're from, but where were you born? And I usually start, or where were you grew up, and I show them where I was born in my small town, and they want to know about it. But it's a way to bring everyone in, and it's not making some people feel left out.
Yeah, I love that. The idea that we're opening up the conversation from where are you from to where did you grow up, and then having a whole world map to show that we do have students from all over the world, and that includes our native born students, that they can be part of that conversation. That's very cool, Heather. Thank you. And Patsy put, I think just noticing what's in textbooks and readings and who is represented is an important first step. And I was just thinking about, I believe Ramadan starts tomorrow. And so maybe something as simple as wishing happy Ramadan to our students, acknowledging that they might be tired, acknowledging that, if you're working with students who will be celebrating or observing Ramadan, they're going to be facing some challenges over the next month of fasting. So that's another way I think that we can help all of our students feel represented. Any other ideas? It would be great to see those. All right, and then we will finish up. And we will finish up with a reminder that our third webinar is coming up on April 18th. It will be from 1:30 to 3. That webinar is about differentiation and social emotional learning. We will again have a guest speaker. Dr. Jamie Kreil will be on that webinar with me. Jamie was part of our ACES advisory team, and she has done a lot of work in this area, and we're excited to have her share with us. And I also do not want to leave out the importance of our own homegrown resources. So the Atlas Resource Library does have a cultural competency collection. And if you have not had a chance to check that out, that is available on the Atlas website. Heather wrote that she was just working on slides for her class tonight, and she was going to mention Ramadan. Gail is reminding us all that you will be getting an email with links for an evaluation. Once you fill out that evaluation, you'll get your CEUs. Gail will also be sending out a PDF of today's slides, and we will get you a recording of this webinar as well. And Patsy is mentioning that Sydney, who was here today, she contributed to that cultural competency library. So I'm sure that's wonderful stuff in there. All right. So that is it for us for today. Again, I know that today's webinar was a little different, a little less participation, a little bit more listening, but we really appreciate you being here. We hope that you're taking away, if nothing else, some ideas about where else you could do some more reading or investigating into this topic. And we hope to see you again soon, either in another ACES webinar or in that DEI cohort that will be launching in later this spring. So thank you all for being here.